August 15th, 1944, 12:20 hours, Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy. Alice Dubois stood in her doorway, watching American soldiers walk past her damaged stone house, their rifles slung casually over shoulders as they moved through streets that had been contested battlefields 72 days earlier during the D-Day invasion. Her daughter Claudette, 4 years old, pressed against Alice's legs and stared at the soldiers with the wariness that 4 years of German occupation had taught French children. Stay quiet, avoid attention, don't trust uniforms. The morning was cool for August, with fog still clinging to the ground in patches that made the American soldiers appear and disappear like ghosts passing through streets Alice had known her entire life, but which now felt transformed by months of occupation followed by weeks of liberation that had turned familiar spaces into something entirely different. The town had been one of the first French communities freed during the airborne assault on D-Day, when American paratroopers had dropped directly onto Sainte-Mère-Église in darkness before dawn on June 6th. Alice had watched that night from her cellar, listening to explosions and gunfire that had seemed endless, not knowing whether she would survive or whether Claudette would live to see morning. The Germans had occupied the town for 4 years, requisitioning homes, demanding food that families couldn't spare, and creating atmosphere of fear that had made ordinary life into careful performance of appearing harmless and invisible. Then suddenly, there were American paratroopers fighting German soldiers in streets where children had played before the war, and by afternoon of June 6th, the swastika flags had been torn down and replaced with French tricolors that people had hidden for years. But liberation hadn't immediately meant safety or abundance. The fighting had continued around Sainte-Mère-Église for weeks as German forces attempted to push back the invasion and American forces fought to expand their beachhead. Artillery shells had damaged many buildings, including Alice's house, where the roof had partially collapsed from a near miss that had killed her neighbor 3 houses down. Food remained scarce because supply lines were disrupted and because German occupation had stripped the region of resources over years of systematic extraction. Now, 10 weeks after D-Day, American soldiers were everywhere, not fighting anymore, but occupying, administering, rebuilding. Alice watched them pass and tried to process the cognitive shift from viewing soldiers as threats to recognizing them as liberators who represented safety rather than danger. The transition was more difficult than she'd anticipated. Soldiers were soldiers. They carried weapons. They moved in groups. They had authority that civilians lacked. 4 years of conditioning couldn't be erased in 10 weeks just because these particular soldiers spoke English instead of German and smiled instead of glaring. One of the American soldiers noticed Claudette staring at him. He stopped, knelt down to her eye level despite the wet pavement, and pulled something from his pocket. A chocolate bar, the kind Alice hadn't seen since before the occupation began in 1940. He held it out toward Claudette, with a gesture that transcended language barriers. "For you. Take it." Claudette looked up at Alice, seeking permission. Alice nodded, still uncertain, but recognizing that refusing would be both rude and foolish when her daughter hadn't tasted chocolate in 4 years, and when American generosity seemed genuine rather than trap. Claudette took the chocolate carefully, examined it as if uncertain it was real, then bit into it with expression that Alice would remember for the rest of her life. Pure joy, untainted by the fear and caution that had defined Claudette's entire conscious existence. The soldier smiled, said something in English that Alice didn't understand, and moved on to rejoin his unit. Claudette clutched her chocolate and looked up at Alice with wonder that made Alice realize how much her daughter had been deprived of beyond just food and safety. She'd been robbed of the simple experience of receiving kindness from strangers, of trusting that adults outside her immediate family might wish her well, rather than viewing her as either irrelevant or potentially dangerous. Alice began crying, tears that surprised her with their intensity. She'd survived 4 years of occupation without allowing herself to cry, because tears were weakness that could attract unwanted attention. She'd endured hunger, fear, and uncertainty without breaking down because her daughter needed mother who remained strong. But this moment, an American soldier giving chocolate to Claudette without asking anything in return, broke through defenses that years of hardship had built. This was what liberation actually meant. Not just the absence of German soldiers, but the presence of people who treated her daughter like a child deserving kindness rather than someone to be ignored or exploited. The arithmetic of suffering. Northern France in August 1944 was landscape of liberation that had been purchased through combat that had killed approximately 79,000 Allied soldiers and wounded 156,000 more during 2.5 months of fighting since D-Day. The civilian cost was harder to quantify, but substantial. French civilians killed by bombing, artillery, and crossfire numbered approximately 20,000 in Normandy alone, with unknown additional thousands injured, displaced, or traumatized by months of living in active combat zone. The physical destruction was extensive and visible. Approximately 60% of buildings in Normandy had been damaged or destroyed by bombing and artillery. Critical infrastructure, including roads, bridges, railways, and ports, had been systematically targeted by Allied air forces attempting to isolate the battlefield, then further damaged during ground combat. Agricultural production had collapsed as farmers abandoned fields that had become battlegrounds or minefields. The occupation that preceded liberation had systematically extracted French resources for German military use over 4 years. Food requisitions had reduced average French caloric intake to approximately 1,400 calories daily by 1944, substantially below the 2,000 calories needed for maintaining health. The German occupation authorities had confiscated agricultural equipment, livestock, and supplies while implementing rationing systems that prioritized German military needs over French civilian welfare. American soldiers arriving in liberated French communities encountered populations that were simultaneously grateful for freedom and traumatized by years of deprivation and fear. The military government teams attached to American combat units had been trained to address practical needs, restore civil authority, distribute food, provide medical care, establish security. But they hadn't been specifically prepared for the depth of psychological damage that occupation had inflicted, or for the challenge of helping French civilians transition from survival mode to something approaching normal life. The children who'd forgotten joy. Children who'd spent years learning to be quiet, careful, and invisible around German soldiers struggled to adjust to American presence that seemed to welcome interaction rather than demand self-effacement. Corporal James Sullivan from Massachusetts noticed this particularly during his assignment organizing recreational activities for French children in several liberated towns. The Army had decided that providing entertainment and normal childhood experiences would improve civilian morale and help children begin recovering from years of trauma. Sullivan had been selected for this duty because he'd worked as elementary school teacher before the war and had experience with child development that made him suitable for task that was unusual military assignment. He organized afternoon programs in town squares and church halls, bringing equipment from Army recreational supplies, balls, jump ropes, board games, art supplies. He invited French children to participate in structured activities that would provide distraction from hardship of post-liberation conditions and opportunity for play that many had been denied during occupation years. The initial response was subdued to the point that Sullivan wondered if the programs would succeed. French children arrived but remained at edges of activity rather than participating enthusiastically. They watched American soldiers demonstrate games but were hesitant to join in. They seemed uncertain whether this was genuine offer to play or some kind of test where mistakes would be punished. Sullivan realized the problem. These children had learned that drawing attention to themselves was dangerous, that soldiers were authority figures to be avoided, and that joy expressed too openly might attract unwanted scrutiny. They needed to be taught that play was allowed again, that American soldiers wanted them to be children rather than smaller versions of fearful adults. He changed his approach, becoming more active in engaging individual children rather than expecting them to volunteer participation. He would roll a ball directly to a specific child, making eye contact and smiling in a way that communicated invitation rather than command. He would kneel down to children's eye level, reducing intimidation factor of his size and uniform. He would demonstrate obvious enjoyment of games he organized, modeling behavior he hoped children would eventually feel comfortable adopting. The breakthrough came during an afternoon, when Sullivan was teaching a group of children how to play baseball using improvised equipment. A stick for bat, a ball made from cloth wound tight and sewn together. A boy approximately 8 years old hit the ball on his third try, sending it flying across the square. Sullivan cheered enthusiastically. Other American soldiers watching joined in the celebration. And suddenly, the boy smiled. Genuinely smiled rather than the careful, guarded expression that had characterized his demeanor until that moment. Other children saw the smile, saw the American soldiers celebrating rather than criticizing, and something shifted. Within minutes, the entire group was playing with enthusiasm that had been absent from previous sessions. They were shouting, laughing, running, behaving like children rather than miniature adults trained in constant vigilance. Sullivan watched the transformation with satisfaction, mixed with sadness, that such basic childhood experience needed to be deliberately reconstructed after years when it had been suppressed. The soldiers who brought more than victory. The American soldiers who liberated northern France in summer 1944 were predominantly young men, average age approximately 23, who'd been raised during the Depression and had enlisted or been drafted into military service that had transformed them from civilians into combat veterans through experiences in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, or the Normandy campaign itself. Most had been in Europe less than a year. Many had never traveled outside the United States before military service. They'd been trained to fight German forces, not to serve as humanitarian workers or civil administrators. But the reality of liberation required skills beyond combat, distributing food to starving populations, providing medical care to civilians who'd lacked adequate health care for years, rebuilding infrastructure, and demonstrating through actions, rather than just words, that American presence represented genuine liberation rather than simply replacement of one occupying force with another. Private First Class Robert Mitchell from Iowa arrived in Sainte-Mère-Église in early August as part of the unit responsible for establishing military government in the town and surrounding area. His assignment involved distributing food from army stores to French civilians, organizing repair work on damaged buildings, and serving as liaison between American military authority and French civilian population that spoke language he didn't understand and had experienced occupation in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Mitchell had been raised on a farm where Depression-era poverty had taught him about scarcity and the importance of helping neighbors during hard times. His parents had struggled through the 1930s, had lost their farm briefly before recovering through hard work and community support, and had taught him that decent people helped those who needed assistance regardless of personal cost. These lessons proved more relevant to his actual duties in liberated France than combat training he'd received. His first morning in Sainte-Mère-Église involved distributing food at a makeshift distribution center in the town square. French civilians arrived carrying whatever containers they could find: battered pots, ceramic bowls, cloth bags. Many were women and children because most adult men were either serving with resistance forces, had been taken for forced labor in Germany, or had been killed during the occupation. The women approached hesitantly, uncertain about procedures, and afraid of making mistakes that might result in being denied food their families desperately needed. Mitchell tried to make the process as simple and non-threatening as possible. He smiled, spoke in English that most recipients didn't understand, but whose tone communicated friendly intent, and provided portions that exceeded official guidelines because the need was so obvious, and the American supplies were abundant enough that generosity wouldn't create shortages. Each recipient received canned goods, flour, powdered milk, and occasional luxuries like chocolate or coffee that American soldiers considered routine, but that represented extraordinary abundance to French civilians who'd lived with severe scarcity for years. One woman approached with 3 children, 2 girls approximately 6 and 8 years old, and a boy who appeared to be about 4. The children were thin, their clothes patched and repatched, their shoes too small or too large, depending on whether they'd been inherited from older siblings or anticipated growth that hadn't yet occurred. The woman spoke in French that Mitchell didn't understand, gesturing toward her children in a way that clearly communicated she was asking for food for them rather than herself. Mitchell filled a large container with supplies, including extra powdered milk specifically for the children. He pulled chocolate bars from his pocket, part of his own rations that suddenly seemed less important than feeding hungry French children. He knelt down and offered the chocolate directly to the children, who stared at it with mixture of longing and uncertainty about whether they were actually allowed to take it. The mother nodded permission. The children took the chocolate, examined it carefully, and then began eating with focused intensity that made clear this was extraordinary treat rather than ordinary food. Mitchell watched them, feeling emotion he couldn't quite name. Satisfaction at providing something valuable mixed with anger that children should be this hungry, mixed with recognition that the war had created countless situations like this throughout Europe. The mother spoke again in French, her tone clearly expressing gratitude. Mitchell responded in English, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would communicate acknowledgement. "It's okay. You're going to be all right now. We'll make sure you have what you need." The moments that transcended language. Sergeant William Parker from Tennessee encountered one such moment while his unit was bivouacked near a small village outside Caen. A French woman approached the American encampment carrying an infant, accompanied by another child approximately 2 years old. She was obviously distressed, speaking rapidly in French and gesturing in ways that clearly indicated emergency, even though Parker couldn't understand specific words. Parker called for the unit's medic and followed the woman back to her home, a partially damaged farmhouse where her husband lay injured from farming accident that had occurred that morning. The man had been attempting to clear debris from a damaged outbuilding when a beam had collapsed, crushing his leg and creating wound that required immediate medical attention, but that the family had no way to treat adequately. The American medic assessed the injury and began treatment, cleaning the wound and administering morphine for pain that was obviously severe. Parker held the infant while the medic worked, the baby staring up at him with wide eyes that seemed to study his unfamiliar face, with expression Parker couldn't interpret. The toddler clung to her mother, watching the American soldiers with fear that Parker wished he could alleviate, but didn't know how to address a cross-language barrier that made verbal reassurance impossible. The treatment took 45 minutes, during which Parker continued holding the infant, who eventually relaxed and fell asleep in his arms. The simple trust implicit in the baby's comfort created unexpected emotional response. Parker was during Reconstruction period. The departure of combat units that had fought for liberation created unexpected emotional response from French civilians who developed relationships with specific soldiers during weeks of close contact. In Sainte-Mère-Église, Alice Dubois watched American soldiers preparing to move out, loading equipment onto trucks, while French civilians gathered to bid farewell to men who'd represented safety and generosity during difficult transition from occupation to liberation. Claudette stood beside her mother, holding the hand of Private Mitchell, who'd become regular visitor to their damaged house, helping with repairs and bringing supplies from American stores. Mitchell had spent evenings teaching Claudette simple English words, showing her pictures of his family farm in Iowa, and demonstrating that soldiers could be friendly rather than threatening. The relationship had been uncomplicated by anything except genuine kindness. Mitchell saw a French child who needed positive adult presence after years of trauma. Alice saw American soldier who treated her daughter with gentleness that was healing in ways beyond just material assistance. The departure meant ending relationship that had become important to both. Mitchell knelt down to Claudette's level one final time, speaking in simple English that she'd learned well enough to understand. "You be good for your mama. You're going to grow up strong and happy. The war is over for you." Claudette responded in careful English. "Thank you for chocolate. Thank you for being nice." Mitchell pulled a small American flag from his pocket, the kind soldiers carried as identification, and gave it to Claudette. So you remember that Americans are your friends. Alice watched the exchange with tears that she'd stopped trying. Soldier trained for combat. But he was also man, who'd grown up helping care for younger siblings and cousins in large extended family where children were valued and protected. Holding this French infant while his medic saved the child's father felt more meaningful than combat actions Parker had performed during months of fighting since D-Day. When the treatment was complete, and the medic had provided supplies for continuing care over the following days, the French woman took her baby back from Parker. She looked at him with expression that communicated gratitude more clearly than words could have managed. Then she kissed him on both cheeks, traditional French gesture that startled Parker, but that he recognized as expression of appreciation that transcended cultural differences. Parker and his medic returned to their unit, carrying supplies that the French family had insisted they accept, despite obvious poverty. A small wheel of cheese that had been carefully hidden during occupation, a bottle of Calvados that represented significant sacrifice, given how scarce luxury items were. Parker felt uncomfortable accepting gifts from people who had so little, but his medic quietly explained that refusing would insult the family's gratitude and dignity. They accepted the gifts, shared them with their squad that evening, and toasted the French family, whose hospitality had demonstrated that even in circumstances of extreme deprivation, people maintained capacity for generosity. The departure that revealed everything. September 1944. American forces that had liberated northern France during summer began moving eastward toward Germany, to be replaced by military government units and follow-on forces that would maintain occupation authority to hide. These weren't tears of grief, but recognition of what American presence had meant beyond just ending German occupation. Mitchell and soldiers like him had demonstrated through actions rather than propaganda that liberation could mean actual freedom combined with generosity that helped people recover dignity that occupation had systematically stripped away. Similar scenes played out across northern France as American combat units moved toward new assignments. French families said goodbye to soldiers who'd shared meals with them. French children waved at trucks carrying away men who'd brought laughter back into lives that had known only fear. And communities that had been liberated not just from German military control, but from 4 years of systematic dehumanization began the longer process of rebuilding that would take years rather than weeks.